Hello, and welcome to the fourth video in the T.J. Jones Library Guide to Exegesis. In the previous three videos, we've mostly been giving you some background and getting started kind of information and an overview of what exegesis is. Now in this fourth video, we're going over to the Contextual Analysis tab. At this point, we're really getting into the heart of your exegesis paper. Matter of fact, we actually recommend that approximately 20% of your paper is devoted to contextual analysis, 50% of your paper is devoted to detailed analysis, and another 20% of your paper devoted to the theology of your passage. This leaves just 5% left for the introduction and 5% for the conclusion and application. But right now, as we're looking in the contextual analysis, you need to sketch the necessary context, or the context that is necessary to understand what your passage means. Now, there are two main areas of context that you'll need to sketch out for your paper. The first is literary context, up at the top, and the second is historical context. So if you're thinking that maybe 20% of your paper is devoted to this contextual analysis, it could be helpful to think that you need to write roughly 10% on literary context and roughly 10% on historical context. So, looking at the literary context, you need to be thinking of two main things. You need to think about the structure of the entire book in which you're working, and you also need to think about the passages surrounding your passage and how your passage is related to those other texts. So, as you're thinking through the overall context of the book, here's a few questions to help you be thinking through what you need to process in order to do sound exegesis. First of all, the most obvious is, what is the genre of the book where your passage is located? For instance, is your passage from the Gospels, or is it from the Epistles? Is it from the Old Testament? Is it a narrative story? Is it part of the prophetic literature? Perhaps your passage is from the book of Psalms. All of these are different genres, and as we read different genres of literature, we have different principles and rules that we apply, mostly naturally and instinctively, to how we are supposed to understand and process and interpret those passages. You might also think through the overall structure of your book. So for instance, some books of the Bible have a very clear structure. I can think of the book of Exodus, which has basically a two-part structure. Chapters 1 through 19 is leading up to Mount Sinai, beginning in Egypt and leading up to Mount Sinai. And chapter 20 through the end of the book are events that take place at Mount Sinai. This is just a basic organizing structure and principle used in the book of Exodus. And many other books have a clear and straightforward structure. As you read through the book of Psalms, you may notice that the Psalms is not just 150 separate songs or poems, but is actually 5 distinct collections of Psalms. And so there's book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, and book 5. And so you'll need to think through the overall structure of your book. And as you do so, you can begin to think about how does your particular passage fit within the overall structure of the book. Another issue related to literary context is authorship. Now, a lot of times there's a lot of debate behind different books of the Bible and who wrote them. These can be very interesting debates, but sometimes can be distracting from the main purpose of an exegesis paper. I would only advise you to use discretion in deciding whether or not you need to address issues of authorship in your particular paper. And as always, I recommend that you talk to your professor directly and get their perspective. They might find it extremely necessary and beneficial for you to address that, or they might say, you know, that's interesting, but is not really going to help you with the exegesis of your paper. And again, as you're doing so, you need to pay close attention to the passages immediately surrounding your own and how your passage relates. So a crucial part of your exegesis paper is analyzing your text as literature. Now, the next part of contextual analysis is historical context. And I'd recommend that you do the historical context after you've done the literary context. So the Bible was given to us as literature, but it is also the product of real people and real historical circumstances. And you need to understand these circumstances, these realities, in order to do good exegesis. However, I want to offer a bit of caution. Many people mistakenly turn their paper, their exegesis paper, into a history paper. And those are actually two separate things. The object of study in a history paper are the events themselves and what actually transpired. Now, the history is certainly important in exegesis, but the object of study in exegesis paper isn't the historical events, but is the biblical text itself. This is a subtle but very important distinction. Now, as you're doing exegesis paper, what you are essentially doing is having a disciplined look at all the different areas that might help you to understand, or angles I should say, angles that will help you to understand your passage and what it means. So you can look at it from a literary angle, you can look at it from a historical angle, you could do a close reading of your text, you're looking at it from a theological angle, and as you put all those together, you should have a pretty good idea of what your passage means. So when thinking through issues of history, try to always ask, how does this help me to understand my passage? If it doesn't help you to understand your passage or is relatively insignificant, it probably doesn't belong in your paper. There are 4 main areas that I would recommend you to investigate. If you address these 4 issues, you will have a very good understanding of the historical context of your passage. These areas are political, economic, social, and religious. So the first question to ask is, what was going on politically at the time period of your passage? Who held political power? It might be necessary to sketch the political background for both the international political scene as well as the domestic or national political scene. They could be very different, and it could vary wildly depending on the time period at which your passage is written. So, was your passage written during the patriarchal period when there was no kingdom of Israel and the land of Canaan was separated into separate city-states? Was it written during the time period of the Judges when there was no unified nation, but at certain periods of time God would raise up a particular leader of the people of Israel? Or perhaps was it written during the monarchy or during the time of Jesus, when the land of Palestine was controlled by an external superpower, the Roman government? All of these are political issues which you need to understand as you're interpreting your passage. You also need to address the economic issues. So what was the economic climate like during the time of your passage? Was it during a time of prosperity, like during the reign of Uzziah in the Old Testament? Or was it during a time of famine, like in the days just coming up to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians? You also need to look at the social issues. Who were the social groups that were present and significant at the time of your passage? Was there social injustice at the time? Did certain social groups hold power while other social groups were marginalized? And how does understanding that help you to understand your passage? And then finally, what was going on religiously? Did your passage take place at the time of the religious reforms of King Josiah? Was it perhaps during the time of idolatry during Manasseh? Understanding the religious atmosphere can really aid in doing an exegesis of your paper. Perhaps there was influence from other religious worldviews at the time of your passage. If you examine the political, economic, social, and religious backgrounds of your passage and ask appropriate questions surrounding those issues, then you will be in a much better place to do a good exegesis paper, to be able to write a good exegesis paper, and to truly understand what your passage means. I will see you in the next video.